Hi everybody, welcome back to Findmypast from home. My name is Ellie, I'm Senior Community Executive for Findmypast, and thank you so much for joining us today. Please do say hello in the comments, say where you're tuning in from, say what the weather is like for you today. If you are joining us for the first time, we host these live broadcasts every week. We do an expert session here on a Wednesday where we usually invite guests on, and today's no exception. And then we do a more informal, laid-back session on a Friday where we talk about Findmypast's new records and all things genealogy, and it's a lot of fun. And the community are lovely and very, very welcoming. So if you are new here, please do introduce yourself and say hello to each other as well. So my guest for today is actually a returning guest. So last year, I cannot believe it's been a year since we had this guest with us. Dr Mike Esbester of the University of Portsmouth joined us last year to talk about railways and accident reports. And it was a real context-setting exercise for our railway ancestors, so we can actually put ourselves in their shoes and imagine what life was like for them. So we're going to expand a little bit on that today, and hopefully we'll get a little bit of an update from Mike as to how his project and his research is coming along. So if Mike would give me a thumbs up, I'll add him into the stream. Yay, lovely. Welcome back, Mike. How are you?
Hi, Ellie. Thanks for having me back. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. It's nice to be back. And it's nice to see some of the comments coming up and some familiar names in there, which is lovely.
Absolutely. Now, as I said, you are a returning guest, but for anybody who didn't catch you with us last year, would you just tell our lovely community a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Firstly, why didn't you catch me last time? So I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Portsmouth, as you've mentioned, and have a lifelong interest in railways, which has taken me down lots of different directions, but I've been fortunate enough to be able to spend time researching and teaching about railway history, amongst other things, in my day job. And I've also been working with a wonderful community of volunteers, including many from the family history and genealogy communities, on the Railway Work, Life and Death project, which, as you said, is looking into accidents to British and Irish railway workers before the Second World War.
Excellent. Now, before we start, let's welcome a few people in the comments here. So we've got Matthew, afternoon from a very dull Watford, he says. We've got Helena, who's from Lancashire. We've got Sylvia with us, who says it's a cool day here in West Yorkshire. Ros joining us from Massachusetts, waiting for the storm, the end of Ida. Oh, goodness, yes. I hope you're all okay stateside. Claire from Australia. Lots of you here today. That's fantastic. I think we've actually just lost Mike, I'm afraid, everybody. So just bear with me a minute while we try and add him back into the stream, and I'll just natter to you all while we wait. I think his webcam might have lost connection. But we'll just try and get him back. Let me know how your day is going, everybody. Have you made any fantastic family history discoveries this week? Are you excited for Friday's Live this week? Because Jen is going to be back and she's going to be talking through all of the amazing record collections that we've added over the past week. So it's going to be really exciting. And this week's one is really, really cool. So I'm gonna stop the teasing there because we do have Mike back. So let's see if we can add him back to the stream now. There we go.
Sorry, entirely my fault. I hit the wrong button. Apologies. Technological ineptitude.
At least it wasn't the gremlins, because the gremlins do like to come out and play when we're live on Facebook and YouTube. So all is good now. So yes, we are going to be talking about railways today. If you do have railway ancestors, please share the stories in the comments. Equally, if you do have any questions for Mike as we go along today, please add them in and we'll try and get to as many as we can. It's really, really helpful for us if you can put question at the beginning of your question, because then we can easily spot the questions in the comments. Now, Mike, you have kindly prepared a short presentation for our lovely community. Should we start with that? And then what we'll do is we'll dig into the detail a little bit more, and I have some questions for you.
Perfect. Let's give that a go. If you can share my screen.
Of course I can. Hopefully. And you just tell me when to unshare. There we go. That's looking good.
Great. Okay, that's excellent. So very much going on a Monty Python theme here in terms of what have the railways ever done for us. Just a really quick overview of a few things it might be worth mentioning. So number one, I think a bit about the development of the railways in Britain. And again, it's worth just showing a brief map at the start of the railway age, what we consider the railway age, the mid-1830s here. The bit on the map that we're interested in are anything in red is a railway line. So 1836, and a couple of images of early railway construction on the left, as you see it. So the Liverpool-Manchester line crossing Chat Moss, again, is regarded at the time as a feat of engineering virtuosity, a marvel of its time, in actually getting something as solid as a railway line across what was a really big natural impediment at the time. Stuff kept sinking in the bog there. So to actually get this railway line across was seen as kind of man-defeating nature at the time. And the lower illustration from one of J.C. Bourne's lithographs and engravings of railway construction on the London to Birmingham route. Again, this idea about human ingenuity changing the landscape. And it did change the landscape quite dramatically. So by the time we get to around the time of the First World War, we're at the peak of the railway network. And you can see the vast change between that earlier slide from 1836 and this 1911. The railway network's huge. It's expanded massively. Of course, that brings with it lots of benefits for people. Increased connectivity. People are able to get around more, and as we'll discuss, not just people. All of this was done albeit with government oversight, some government oversight, but through a system of private enterprise, effectively. We're looking at private companies. So by this time, we've got around 20,000 miles of railway track, which means that with the exceptions of some of Mid Wales and the northernmost areas of Scotland, the density of network is pretty big here. You're never all that far away from a railway station, it seems. There's a couple of oddities differences in the 20th century. You get the First World War, the state gets involved on a war footing and takes over control of the railways. After the First World War, in fact, we've just passed the centenary of the Act of Parliament which grouped the 120 or so private railway companies into 4 major companies, which was the situation through into the Second World War, when again the state took control of the railways to try and make sure that everything was pushing in the same direction during the war. And at the end of 1947, start of 1948, the railways were nationalised. So again, this time come back into state control in a more permanent form and in a rather different way, lasting until we get much more recently into the 1990s, when the industry is privatised and you get the re-emergence of private railway operating companies. There's all sorts going on in this period, and particularly thinking about the post-war period, people will no doubt be familiar with Dr. Beeching and Beeching's axe. Although that said, there were actually plenty of line closures in the 1920s and 1930s in the face of road competition, for example. So this map just gives you a bit of an idea of the extent of the closures over a roughly 20-year period following Beeching's report and as it was implemented. So again, quite a dramatic change in the transport infrastructure for the British Isles. So that's kind of some of the
huge changes there.
Absolutely, and it's these have lasting impacts today. And again, I was just reading today about the reopening of Soham Station in Cambridgeshire, one of the stations that was closed under Beeching, I think. So it's not talking about reversing Beeching, and we shouldn't be talking about reversing Beeching. We should be thinking about, well, where do we have the strategic need for rail now? Thinking about environmental issues and so on. So there's all sorts of challenges that the railway industry faces to this day, but it's performing a useful and important service for many of us. And I think we probably all agree that there's scope for improvement. So to focus then less on the kind of the companies, the infrastructure and the doing of building railways, I'd like us to think a bit about the wider context. So here we've got an image of Liverpool Station as it was in the early 1830s. So again, right at the dawn of the mainline railway age. And it looks kind of odd to us now from today's perspective, of course, but at the time this would have been seen as quite revolutionary. And really kind of, this was the height of modernity of its time. And it reshaped towns, quite literally in some cases. So here we've got a Gustave Doré engraving from, I think, the 1870s, looking through a railway viaduct arch towards another one at the summer slum housing that the railway lines both cut through and also cleared. So there's huge kind of changes to not only the landscape in the countryside, but the urban infrastructure as well, which has some really far-reaching impact for the people affected. Again, this is a view towards St Paul's Cathedral in London. You can see how railways were moving freight right into the heart of the city. Again, quite a squalid, I think this is possibly post-Second World War, but quite a squalid sort of a view. And the dirt and the grime of it was being really captured here. The railways by the time of the 1940s were really quite run down, certainly after the Second World War. But they also enable, in all sorts of different ways, things that practices that didn't happen in such a way before. So commuting, for example. So we've got an early picture from the Underground here. Again, about allowing all sorts of different classes of people access to travel. So workman's train, and they're called workman's trains, although of course they carried women as well, into and out of London at particular times, so early in the day, later in the day, trying to avoid the rush and avoid the kind of middle class commuters as well. So really interesting aspects of that class that get captured. Yeah. And holiday traffic as well, and excursions. So this idea about being able to travel places on a day trip or for longer, and that increased accessibility, particularly, for example, for seaside trips and so on. So there's lots going on here that the railways enable. Plus, of course, the spread of newspapers, the movement of freight, so fresh milk into cities, eggs, farm and market traffic as well. So there's all sorts going on that the railways are involved in and help kind of change the ways in which people are living their lives. And I should say, just on the sport connection as well, really interesting things about the ways in which railways enable greater movement and the ease of travel for sports matches as well. So people may or may not know that what we now know as Manchester United actually started as the football team for the Newton, excuse my doorbell, the football team for Newton Heath Works on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. So there's an awful lot going on there that helps. Again, holiday excursions we've mentioned. What I wanted just to end this little bit on was also some people are afraid. There were senses of fear with travel. So here we have a picture from John Martin's paintings of the Last Judgment from the 1850s. Kind of dreadful depictions of the end of days. But what's quite interesting about this one is that he sneaks, it's difficult to see in this resolution, but he sneaks in a train disappearing over the abyss into this. He's kind of got this, what doesn't look that industrial setting, but he's sneaked in this kind of symbol of modernity, but also something that he's kind of people were slightly nervous about coming into play as well. There's all sorts of interesting things that the railways do. Timetables may not be beloved of everybody. Fascinating things. I've spent some time researching them. But what I want to point your attention to on this one, thinking a bit about the ways in which lives are changed, is that this idea about the spread of standardised time. So here we've got a little thing in there, note 12, the clocks are set according to the longitude of each station. So this is pre-standardised time. Time in Britain wasn't standardised until, I'm going to say 1880. I think internationally not till 1885, possibly. So on the Grand Junction Railway, so between Liverpool and London, you would end up with different times at the station, depending on how far west you go. The Great Western Railway, on the other hand, from 1840, I think standardised their time and said, right, well, we're just running on London time. which Greenwich Mean Time as it became, and kind of became a standard measure. So this idea about railways quite literally changing time as people experienced it comes into play, which is, again, really fascinating to think of now, I think.
I'd never realised that before.
Yeah, it's not something, why should we? It's kind of, time is just time, isn't it? It's constant, it doesn't, it's immutable, but no, it's, again, really, really kind of interesting thing, I think, and something that the railways, because they needed to be connected, it was a safety mechanism eventually that effectively saying, well, you can't be setting trains off at different times from different places according to local time, because they're gonna come together, and we don't want that to happen. So, a very, very real kind of change to the ways in which people experience their lives. And what I think is also fun to think a bit about, again, is about what people are experiencing. So for many, travelling on a railway is a new thing. They haven't done it, and they don't know how to do it. The speed is very different. How to look out of a speeding carriage, we might know that now. You look into the distance, you don't want to be looking close up. But what do you look for? What do you look at? So one of the railway newspapers, the Railway Chronicle, produced these wonderful travelling charts, which would give you, albeit very, very wordy, a description of what you can see from either side of the train as you go. I've included this one as it's close-ish to Portsmouth, ends in Gosport, just over the way from Portsmouth. But Portchester Castle you can see up here, and some things of interest in the castle, and so on. So again, a really interesting idea about people sitting in their carriage, using this thing to understand the landscape around them. Doesn't say much about the experiences of traders, farmers sending their goods up to town, manufacturers, and so on. But there's still a lot going on in these things. And I quite like thinking a bit about the railway towns that were created by the companies, new towns where they hadn't previously existed, that were built effectively to serve the needs of the railway companies. Classic examples would be Swindon or Crewe, Doncaster maybe, Derby. Some places did exist beforehand, but the railways had a huge impact on the area. So to wrap up, a couple of slides, just a couple of images of railway staff and the sorts of work that they were doing, because of course you had this huge network, you needed people to operate it. So you've got all sorts going on, whether it's top left, people working on the tracks, in this case in amongst moving trains, not particularly safe. Or top right, you have a shunter who is coupling two goods wagons together, so using the pole that he's holding to lift up. You can just see hanging down here three links. He's got another three on the coupling pole, and he's going to hook them over a hook on the other wagon to join them together. People have this romanticised view of railway work, but there were mucky elements to it, particularly in the steam era. When you get to the end of a day's service, you need to get the remains of the coal and fire out of the engine, and you trundle your engine along to a siding which would have a pit in it, drop the ash out underneath, so into the pit. Someone would have to go and shovel that out. So really filthy, hard, hot work. And bottom right, this one's inside Doncaster Works in the Second World War. We've got some women riveting on a locomotive boiler here. I always look at this and think, well, they're not wearing any goggles or anything like this. You can't, no real safety gear there. Again, sign of the times. And just to flag up, again, people might not know about the variety of railway work. We think about driving the engines and maybe a station master or a passenger guard, but the railways had interest in all sorts of different things. We talked a little bit about shunting, so bottom left, moving wagons and goods, but railway workshops, the bigger railway companies, made pretty much everything that they wanted to use. And I think the bottom right image is from Shildon Works. Top right, again, First World War image of women cleaning locomotive. Not something they would have done beforehand, and not for long after the First World War. But again, new opportunities, new roles. Plenty of women worked on the railways as well. So I think before the First World War, we're looking at kind of 13, 14,000 perhaps. It's not out of a total of 640,000, give or take. So it's not a big percentage, but there were more than one or two. Top left, Garston Docks, unloading bananas just before the First World War. So again, the railways had extensive interest in shipping, docks, road interest, so whether it's motor vehicles or earlier horse and cart. And in the 1930s, they extended into air interest as well. So flying out to the Channel Islands, for example. Finally, just to mention, again, coming very much out the Railway Life and Death Project interest, there's a darker side to all of this. I mentioned about the fears that people had about railway travel, some people had, and one of the reasons why was because passenger crashes, as we see here on the left from the 1870s, were they're undoubtedly horrendous. They were not helped by press depictions as this one, which were often very melodramatic, in keeping with a lot of the Victorian press. So here we've got women, dead and dying, being pulled from the wreckage, the helpless women as well. But the staff bore the brunt of the casualties, leading to posed accident prevention images like the one top right, being put about from just about the time of the First World War through, actually in various different forms up to the present. So that's all I was going to say about this. Just a kind of a really quick, if you pardon it, whistle-stop tour of some useful, hopefully interesting aspects of the railways in Britain. I would say, it's not that the railways changed absolutely everything about people's lives, but they had all sorts of influences over a lot of things, a lot of aspects, sometimes in quite subtle ways, sometimes in more obvious ways. So they're a really, really kind of interesting and important aspect of our 19th and 20th century and into the 21st century history. So if you are happy, we can stop sharing.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. We've had some really insightful questions and comments while you've been presenting, but before we touch on those, you've reminded me of the fact that the railways changed an awful lot for the landscape of the country, for people's lives and things like that. But you're absolutely right. It must have been quite unnerving, and I think scary is probably the right word.
Some of the early where people have written diaries and recollections of the early days of railway travel, really the 1830s. It's amazing to see kind of how they're describing it and the apprehensions they have, the excitement as well. So it's as always, there's two sides to the coin on this, but it's it's such a dramatic change. And what I think is just as interesting as that is how quickly it becomes normal and institutionalized. So this idea that some people put about, and a couple of who presented themselves as medical experts said, well, you can't build tunnels because as the train goes through the tunnel, all the air will be forced out and people will suffocate. And people took it seriously because to them it was a kind of a logical thing that there wasn't going to be space for air and the train in the tunnel space. But again, really quickly, those concerns, those fears disappear. Other things take their place, perhaps, but things change and very quickly. Certainly, the start of the railway era.
I suppose as well, it's part of such a huge change with the the Industrial Revolution. It's the things our ancestors must have seen and experienced, and suddenly from going from farming into factories and onto the railways. Yeah, it's a lot to get your head around.
Yes, absolutely. And with the urbanization that came along with it and was involved, part and parcel of it. Absolutely, there's the changes in a generation were really quite profound.
Before we move on then, because I want to just touch a little bit more on occupations, if that's okay. I just want to bring up some of these really good comments that we had here. Let me just scroll back up and just see what I can find. Because a lot of people saying, if they don't have, some people saying, yes, I've got a railway ancestor, or no, I don't, but I really have an interest in this, or an ancestor or a relative who unfortunately met their end on the railway. I just want to see if I can bring some of these up. Scrolling through. So Judith says that her ancestor Huskinson died on the railways. Is this a case you're quite familiar with?
Well, I was hoping, I was looking for that one as well, because I saw it go past and I missed it. Now, I'm presuming that this is William Huskinson, so commonly held to be the first person to die on the railway. So the MP who was hit at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester railway, and not a good omen for the staff of the railway age. Sadly, plenty of people did die before him, hit by trains, again, more typically workers or falling off. And again, you have stories with some evidence of people not knowing how to, they were used to being able to step off, say, a horse and carriage whilst it was moving slowly. And the tales that were related, certainly in the press, how true that makes them, I don't know, of someone losing their hat, it being blown off, and they step off the train as it's going to try and retrieve their hat because they thought they could do it, and of course they fall at speed from a height and die. So plenty of people did. But yes, Judith, fascinating and really amazing to have a descendant there of I would say probably the most famous railway accident that there is.
Yes, a sad end for your ancestor, Judith, but very exciting for Mike to have you here.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's have a look here. I'm just still scrolling through. I'm scrolling slowly to make sure I don't miss anything. So Sylvia says, my railway ancestor died sadly in the workhouse infirmary of general paralysis of the insane. Goodness.
Hi Sylvia, nice to see you out there. Yes, again, there's one of the things that we're finding with the project work that's been really interesting is more and more about health of workers rather than just accidents. So, and there are questions a bit about, well, what happens to people after accidents or after ill health that arises from their occupation, and we haven't been able to look at that data in detail yet because we're still working on it, but I suspect there's going to be more similar sorts of cases where there were underlying issues perhaps, or issues that do arise from the occupation that mean people have sadly a prolonged decline.
I don't know if I told you since the last time we spoke, Mike, I moved to Edinburgh and I decided to look into the previous occupants of where we live. And one of them, unfortunately, I can't remember whether he died on the railway down the road towards Leith, or whether he did it on purpose, he killed himself. I can't remember. I would need to look up the reports again. But it's just reminded me of that because Karen actually says she's got no railway employee ancestors, but two who did take their own lives on the railway.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is, again, it's obviously suicide at any time is particularly difficult. It's also one that's really, historically, it's difficult to research in relation to the railways, because whereas passenger accidents were investigated by the state, some railway worker accidents leave records, although a great many don't. But there was virtually no interest in either suicides or deaths through trespass. Basically, they were kind of tallied up and said, right, that's an unfortunate number. That's it. Now, obviously, thankfully, attitudes have changed, and one of the great things now is that Network Rail and the current rail industry are doing some brilliant work with Samaritans to help train railway staff to spot the signs of people who might be thinking about suicide, and in a non-intrusive way, try and intervene to help before they decide to take any decisions to try and end their lives. So, as I say, I'm very pleased that things have changed. But again, historically, there's an awful lot going on there, and it's again a very difficult topic, both to think about, to understand, and to research.
Absolutely. There are a couple of other comments that you guys have left about your ancestors and how they unfortunately perished. I'm not going to show all of them on screen, a little bit graphic, but they are there. Pam saying, my 2 times great grandfather was a plate layer.
Okay, great stuff. Dangerous occupation. Sadly, I've just been writing today a little bit about a centenary that we're approaching of a particularly nasty accident. But plate layers were track workers, so maintaining the railway lines themselves. And as we saw in one of the images of railway work, they were out working in amongst moving trains. So it was dangerous, and tragically, when something happened, it tended to be quite bad because you'd be working in a gang of men, and they were, with brief exception of the Second World War, they would have all been men who were doing that job. If a train knocked into them, then understandably, they're bad. It's pretty bad.
Absolutely, and we've got Louise.
A vital job.
Sorry, go on.
That's why I was just saying, a vital job. The system, they were absolutely fundamental to keeping the system running.
Absolutely. I think there's a small delay on the stream, so apologies, everybody. So Louise, who's joining us on YouTube, says, my 3 times great-granddad, John Pettigrew, worked for the railways in Lanarkshire and Edinburgh in the 1850s and 60s. It said he was an engine driver and lost his arm in an accident, and then he worked in a signal box. So
absolutely, that is entirely credible. I've found a couple of cases recently, albeit from dating from the early 1900s, where something similar happened, and I was not expecting the person involved to go back into a role like signalling. Now, because it is a physical job, quite manual, very hands-on. So with only one arm, there may be issues there about what it would be possible to do, but obviously there was some way of there were ways around that, or the tasks that they were doing. So yeah, completely. I could, just as an aside, found a fascinating case from the 1890s, I think, of what had been formerly a driver, I think, for the London North Western Railway, and he lost a leg in an accident, but went back as an engine driver around the Wolverton works there. So disability was absolutely no impediment, and the railway companies did make efforts to find alternative employment, albeit very often of a kind of a lesser sort and at a lesser rate of pay. The railway companies were fundamentally interested in making money. They had shareholders to satisfy, and sadly they spotted a bargain when they saw one in that case. But it was at least some form of income for the disabled worker. So it's not ideal, but it was something.
That's something I did want to go back to, actually, was the range of sort of occupations that the railways provided. And you were talking earlier about thousands and thousands of workers. I mean, what did this do for employment?
So in the 19th century, particularly early railway age, I suspect that everyone out there who's done research into their family history, or family history more generally, will have a much better idea than me on this one. But the shift from ag labs to other occupations, industrial occupations, and the railways were a good facilitator of that. Better paid. The wages were better fundamentally, so that's always going to be a big selling point. And again, in those early years into the 19th century, when you're looking at hundreds of thousands employed, there was a need for a workforce. So there's capacity there, particularly in the era of kind of 1840s, 1850s, a big railway expansion. So yeah, there's a lot here about not only being able to move people from place to place, but someone's really keen to see me today. But yeah, not only being able to move people from place to place to get to new forms of employment, but the railways as employers themselves.
There was a comment I saw earlier, but I think I've lost it now. Somebody was talking about their ancestor was a nailer for most of their life, and then the railways came around, and then they were employed by the railways, and they worked on the railways. And it just that's the whole trajectory. that's a difficult word to say under pressure, trajectory of your life just suddenly turns around by the arrival of this machine.
Yeah, and what's another really interesting thing about this is about the degree of occupational ability within the railways. So for some grades, if you wanted to progress, you wouldn't be able to stay put. So you would be working at one level, one grade, and the employer would effectively say, well, if you want to move up to the next level, you need to move 50, 60, 70, 80 miles away to this station where there's a vacancy. And you'd uproot your family, and bang, there you go, you get your upgrade, and the same thing would happen again and again. So there's been some really interesting work tracing the moves that some people make as part of their work.
And let's just move on to your research for a moment and the Railway Work, Life and Death Project. Because last time you were on, you did go into this in a little bit of detail, but I'm just thinking, could you refresh and remind our community, and especially for anybody who didn't join us last year, it has been 12 months. So what is the Railway Work, Life and Death Project, and are there any updates that you have that you can share with us?
Lovely, yeah, thanks very much, Ali. So we are a voluntary project split between my institution, the University of Portsmouth, the National Railway Museum up at York, the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, and we're working with the National Archives. And what we're trying to do is make better available accident records relating to staff in Britain and Ireland, because of course up till 1921 all of Ireland came within the purview of the UK, and thereafter only Northern Ireland. So accidents to staff left some records, not tons, but some, and they're not generally known about, but they have really useful, interesting detail about the people involved, what they were doing, what was going on, and in some cases the consequences, what happened next with their lives. So there's, we were aware of this vast body of material that's out there that's going to be really useful to all sorts of people, whether it's academics, family historians, local historians, the current rail industry, all sorts, the museums and archives themselves as well. So there's loads of people, if only we could get access to that material. So what our brilliant volunteers, and as ever, thanks to all of our volunteers, have been doing is some have been transcribing some of those records, some have been researching the people involved in more detail, and we're making it freely available through the project website. So one of the brilliant things about this is it's free. At the moment, we've got about 6,500 cases available. We're working on a big update at the moment, which I'm hoping to get out soon. I'm not going to say September, because we're now in September and we're not quite there yet. But when it happens, certainly this year, basically we're going for as soon as possible. When that happens, that will bring in around 15,000 more records. And then next year, hopefully we've got another 20,000 or so records on top of that we're working on. So there's a lot of material out there. By the time we're finished, we're hoping that, we don't really know because no one's really counted this, but we're hoping, we estimate there'll be about 80,000 individuals named and detailed in the reports. So what I say to people is, if you've got railway ancestors, there is a chance, particularly if they did manual work, that they had an accident, then the project can help you. You might find details of your ancestor in there. And just as an aside, we've had one case recently where we've written a blog post. One of the volunteers on the team had written a blog post about a particular individual she found in the records, a Spanish immigrant to South Wales who was injured while he was working before he then emigrated over to the States and plenty of other places. We just had a contact from grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I had no idea there was a Spanish community in South Wales at the time, and still to this day, certainly of Spanish descent anyway, which is lovely. So I've just replied to them. I'm hoping we can keep in touch and make something of it, because it's wonderful when we get those connections. People saying, I found my great-grandfather or what have you in the records, and it's cleared up a family mystery. We didn't know about this. That's always wonderful when that happens.
It's so special when that happens. Without going into too much detail, we've got some new records coming on Findmypast next week, I think. and all these records were kept by a particular person, and I can't reveal who it is yet, sorry. And I have been looking into seeing if this particular person has any living descendants, because I think that would be really special to make that connection between the past and the present. But just going back to the project, I think it's a real testament to how records like this, they don't just happen and come online and are digitized and are searchable overnight. It is the work of, you know, volunteers or people working for whichever company it is, whether it's Findmypast or somebody else. And there is so much work and so much dedication and so much expertise that goes into making these records searchable and available online. And so you're not going to an archive or a library and you've got a pile of reports and documents and you're physically trying to find your ancestor in them. It's just amazing.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm always a big fan of seeing the real thing. I think there's a real value in seeing, holding, smelling the real thing. You know, that particular smell of documents of a certain age. That said, you know, I'm fortunate in that there is a bit of time in my job where I can do that, and I'm within reach of the relevant archives, and I know that this material is out there. Many people don't know it's out there. They can't get to the archives. They might be on the other side of the world for whatever reason, inaccessible. So doing something like this, and you know, there are plenty of other projects doing very similar sorts of things with other sets of records. You know, it is brilliant, and it's wonderful when we get the comments back in, and I'm sure the same for other projects. That it gives the volunteers. We do pass this on to the volunteer teams. You know, it gives everyone a real boost.
And I suppose it's quite special as well. Anybody who's been involved in a project like this, whether you've been doing volunteer transcribing or anything like that, you are part of preserving history. And I just think there's something so special about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't put it better.
Okay, lovely. If you do have any more questions for Mike about the Railway Work, Life and Death project, please do add them into the comments. Alex, who is in the comments today, has shared a link to the website if you want to go and find out more. Okay, let's move on. Can we talk for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so about hazards a little bit? This does tie into your research a little bit. And we've already touched on that. You know, the railways, there were accidents, there were deaths, there were suicides, etc. But without getting too graphic, the railways were fantastic, but they also were a little bit hazardous. What could the everyday worker on the railways do in a laborious? That's not even a word. A labour-intensive job. What hazards might they experience?
So, you know, as always, it depends on the precise role they're in. Just to start off with a non-labour intensive one, actually, I was at Didcot Railway Centre over the bank holiday weekend. They had a 60th anniversary steam up, and it's great. Of course, being there, I kind of ducked into the antiquary and picked up a few bits and pieces of paperwork, one of which was an accident report for a clerk, a booking lad, so kind of 14, 15-ish would have been probably, and he had dropped an account book on his toe. And so ended up with a bruised toe. So you know,
must have been a big account book.
Well, some of these ledgers were huge. So there's, you know, from one end of the spectrum, really, in some sort of clerical work. Yeah, that probably is one of the hazards you've got. It's more when you get to the manual end of things that you end up with problems, as you probably expect. So if we talked a bit about working on the tracks, so permanent way, plate layers, so on, then yes, there are issues in terms of being hit by trains. Similarly with good staff, so shunters are people who are coupling and uncoupling the wagons, goods guards, so the guard that sits at the end of a goods train, but he doesn't just do that, and again would have been male throughout the period, certainly that probably the whole of the period we had goods guards in that sense. There you're out in amongst moving trains, and you know there's a lot going on. If you're in a yard late at night that's poorly lit, the weather's not great, you're tired because you've been on shift for 10 hours, it's understandable that you might slip, stumble, trip. You know, quite one of the interesting things about the sorts of things that we see is that while some things have changed very greatly amongst the industry, obviously we're not steam traction anymore. There's less freight being moved. There's a lot reduced mileage and so on. But some things remain the same in terms of the accidents that happen, which is one of the reasons why the current industry is interested. So slips, trips and falls are in there as big issues. Again, the dangers of working on track are in there as issues that we've seen. Carriage cleaners as well. So that's one way you do get women workers appearing in particular. And again, they're working on trains. Generally, they're stationary, but sometimes they're being shunted, so moved around, and they're not ready for that to happen, and they fall and hit themselves, fall out of carriages, and so on. And yeah, there's all sorts. It depends a bit on what records we got left. Unfortunately, what we don't have much of is records for factory roles. So inside the railway works, the workshops, where you've got machinery moving and all sorts of processes, iron, steel, foundry work going on. So there's a lot that we don't have much about, but we get a sense of the sorts of hazards from other occupations outside the railways.
And the thing you said a moment ago about how do I put this? Things that still happen today on the railways and like on the underground in London, for example. There's this kind of stuff that's still happening that was happening, over 100 years ago. Oh
yes, I completely. And again, one of the tragic things about this is the track work is where the real similarities are now. I'm pleased to say some of those are about to end. So 2 years, 2 years ago, just over now, two track workers were hit by a train in South Wales, a place called Margam, and killed. And that's made the regulator finally say to Network Rail, no, this has got to stop. This can't go on. So they issued them with an improvement notice, which said basically you've got to get your act together and sort this out. And Network Rail, to their credit, have done that. They are still working on it. It's not perfect. There was a track worker killed earlier this year, sadly, near Surbiton, a man called Tyler Byrne. But what that has done has said, right, well, we had until end of June 2022 to try to improve things, and we're going to bring that forward to the end of 2021. So at the end of this year, there will be no more work done by people on the railway lines where you've just got a person looking out. So, because then you're reliant on someone kind of keeping an eye out, and people are forgetful, they miss things. There may be all sorts of work-related pressures and stresses going on in their everyday lives that have an impact on their work, and they miss something. And unfortunately, if you're on a track and you miss a train, that's a real problem. So Network Rail are going to be stopping that from the end of this year. So, what we see, these terrible incidents where you have multiple fatalities and injuries, are going to become a thing of the past because there are other better methods that are going to be used. So, it's ultimately it will end up being a positive tale. It's just sad that it's kind of taken a lot of time and effort and lives to get there.
Absolutely. And I just noticed the time. We're coming up to the hour. There is something I wanted to touch on before we wrap up, if that's okay with you. And it's a question that has bugged me for a while. And the reason I say it is because I go down to London in normal times, non-pandemic times. I go to London about once a month. And it's often struck me about why there are so many major train stations so close to each other. So like you've got King's Cross and Euston, I think, that are within a mile of each other. Exactly.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why? That's just a bit daft to me. Why are there so many train stations so close to each other?
So this is one of the brilliant things about why understanding the past is so important. It's an entirely product of the way in which the railway industry started. So I think I mentioned it was private enterprise. It was lots of individual competing companies. By the time you got to the First World War, about 120 of them. And each one of those companies, if they're in the region that's going to be heading towards London, wanted a slice of that market, and they would plough their line through the neighbourhoods and as close into the centre as they could get, and then build a station there. Obviously a big job, but it means that you've then ended up with all these different routes, sometimes serving different geographies. So, Paddington Station, Waterloo Station, Charing Cross, and so on. But sometimes you're quite right, serving very similar sorts of things. And St Pancras is a kind of classic example of that. It was, I think, the last mainline railway terminal to be built in London. It was very late, I think early 1900s possibly, as a result of the Midland Railway basically saying, right, well, we want to get down into London and that's the way we're going to do it. Sometimes the railway companies will cooperate and you'd make arrangements where you could run your trains over somebody else's lines and share a station, say. But some of the railway companies were effectively bitter rivals and wouldn't allow that. They tried to do their best to stymie the opposition and absolutely refuse. And so if the other company could find a way, they would build their station and stick two fingers up to the opposition as far as possible. So it does mean we've ended up with this really, what looks like on paper, really inefficient network, because you had lots and lots of kind of parallel lines or different, again, outside London as well, big cities which were served by multiple different companies. Whereas if someone sat down and planned it, as was the case on continental Europe, where you had state control, so there's a degree more coordination and planning, and you say, well, we don't need three companies serving that city, we just need the two or the one. It didn't happen that way in the UK. We went our own way, which not necessarily efficiently, it has to be said.
So the short answer is money and competition.
Yep, pretty much, and stubbornness.
Oh, it's so funny because, it's just always baffled me about, I mean, yes, okay, London is a huge city. It's a huge sprawling city that has grown and grown and grown over the decades. But at the same time, when I can walk from, King's Cross to Euston in 15 minutes, I think it takes me 15 minutes. I can't quite remember. I think that's just a bit bizarre. But
yes, yeah.
Before our time. Okay, now before we finish up, let me just have a scroll back through the comments and let's just see if we've got any questions we can answer here. And Mike, please feel free to scroll around. If there's any that you'd like to read out, please feel free to. So William saying, did railway companies with more money buy someone else to get where they wanted? Like today with these patent disputes, big companies tend to buy the little companies.
Sort of, yeah. There were lots of mergers, and generally it was to form a bigger conglomerate and to get into spaces that they wouldn't necessarily have access to otherwise. So I've been hedging my bets a bit when I've been saying there are about 120 companies. It's quite difficult to give a precise answer at any given moment because there are so many of these mergers and changes going on. You kind of often end up with a few little companies combining into one slightly bigger company, and then they get bought out by someone else. So yeah, absolutely, there's a degree of that going on.
And Karina says, my maternal grandfather was a railway worker in 1939. He lived in Devon. I'd love to be able to find out more about the history of the railway.
So I'd say two things on this. And one, generally, have a look at the resources from the National Railway Museum, just online. Obviously, depending on where you are, if you can get in there, great, so much the better. They're a wonderful, friendly bunch, but the online content is really brilliant as well, which will give you all sorts about kind of general background and some more specific angles. And the other thing I should have said earlier, of course, was whilst the project is looking at accidents, which you kind of think, well, that's not a cheery subject. What it also tells you about is about the kind of general working practices people are actually doing on the ground, and you can learn a tremendous amount about their lives and their work and their tasks as well as the dangers, even if it's not your particular ancestor. If you go and look at a couple of examples of shunters, say, and the accidents that we got through the data, through the database, then you can see, oh, actually, although my ancestor was a shunter isn't here, I can see the sorts of things that they would have been doing now. So there are different kind of ways into it. As always, we need to think a bit more creatively about it. And I would say that what's really useful if you are researching your railway ancestors is certainly knowing which company they work for. If you don't know that, then knowing roughly which geography they worked in or lived in, because sometimes you can tell. Some regions were only served by one railway company, so you can make a reasonable assumption that it was that company. Others, obviously, where you've got more than one company and it becomes a bit more problematic. But generally speaking, location, railway company, those are two really good pieces of information to start with, and digging around using the various resources that are available. You can find out an awful lot, which is brilliant, I think.
And I suppose as well, not every rail company would have kept, they wouldn't, or the railway companies, they would have kept slightly different records. They won't have all been singing off the same hymn sheet, would they?
Definitely not. So again, one of the things to remember about railway records is they were produced for an operational purpose at the time, and they were kept as long as they were useful. And it's chance in many respects, as it is with all records, that we've got what we've got, and selections have been made along the way and so on. So we certainly haven't got complete runs, but the railways were really meticulous record keepers. They had to be operationally to make sure that everything was working as it should do, and that included managing the staff with so many people to look after. So you might get lucky and get decent records for railway ancestors, and generally speaking, employment records will be held at the National Archives at Kew.
Quick one from Andrea. My ancestor was a gland packer on the Great Central Railway. Would love to know what he actually did.
Well, now this is where we test knowledge. So I have a feeling this is, I think it's a kind of what would have been known as a fitter. So someone who would have worked with stock, and so particularly engines, where you had anything that had moving oil in it. So you'd make sure that the joints where oil is moving were tight, so that no oil is going to leak. So I think it's probably to do with that, but I couldn't say for sure. One thing I would recommend for this is try the, what's it called, Dictionary of Old Occupational Terms, which is available online. Absolutely brilliant. It's taken from the two versions out there, but they're taken from occupations that were listed in the census for 1921 and for, I think, 1891 possibly. So you've got kind of that will, I'm absolutely certain that will be in there, and hopefully confirming what I said.
Couple more questions. Anne says, are there any Scotland records? My great-grandfather was supposedly a station agent in Oban, injured on the railway and died in Scotland.
Okay, so the Scottish records, you're quite right to pull me up on this. I always forget this. Apologies to the Scottish out there. They will be in the National Records Scotland if they exist. One brilliant thing about Scottish records is that because obviously the legal system has been different, whereas most of the coroner's records for England and Wales have been destroyed, the fatal accident inquiries records for Scotland haven't. So if it was, if the death was a result of that accident, then there's a chance that there would have been a fatal accident inquiry, in which case there's another chance that the accidents will survive. So again, I'd try National Records Scotland for that and see what luck you have, and good luck.
And of course, the newspaper collection as well. We've got a brilliant Scottish newspaper collection on Findmypast and the British Archive. There may be some details in there for you as well, Anne.
Yeah, Ali, sorry, you're absolutely right. The newspaper records are absolutely brilliant for, particularly sadly for deaths. And again, for England and Wales, because they often reprint the coroner's inquests, if not verbatim, then close to it. And likewise in the Scottish cases. So you get plenty of detail in there. Local newspapers are such a brilliant resource.
And one more question, if that's okay with you, Mike.
Please.
Jean says, hi, where can I find details of engine drivers in Edinburgh for the early 1930s, please? So
you're in luck in one way, that when selections were made as to which records to keep, which staff records to keep, very often people chose what was seen as the labour aristocracy, so the footplate crews, the drivers, the firemen, and so on. So there's a chance that those records may survive, whereas they didn't keep the records for labourers, say, in any way, near the same way. So as to the Scottish side, I'd say if it's for a solely Scottish company, because some companies obviously operate across borders, try National Records Scotland. and see what they've got. I haven't been able to get there in person to look at those records, but they have got some. It's not as plentiful from what I've seen on the catalogues as the English and Welsh records, but there are some. So that would be my first port of call, I'd say.
Fantastic. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I suppose we'd better wrap up and let everybody get on with their evenings. It has been a fascinating hour, Mike. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back and chat to us about the Railway Work, Life and Death Project, but also about the history of the railways and the clear impact that it had on our ancestors' lives, whether they worked on the railways or not.
Well, Ellie, thank you very much for having me back. Apologies for a duff internet connection at times, it seems, and the interruptions from the doorbell, but I've really enjoyed it. I always like talking about railways and the project and so on, so it's been my pleasure. Thanks to everyone for your questions and so on. I will have a look through the comments and try to respond as soon as possible.
Lovely, thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping bits. So Friday's Live is on as usual on Friday, where we'll be talking about our new records of the week. And also next week, Miko is back for his monthly genealogy Q&A. So make a little note of your questions for him and make sure you tune in on Wednesday. Have a lovely afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world, and take care of yourselves. And thank you again to Mike for being a wonderful guest.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.